Analyst is Professor Timothy Niblock. He is Professor Emeritus, Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies in the University of Exeter, UK. His short bio runs into almost a page and a half, so I'll pick the highlights. He was previously Professor of Arab Gulf Studies at the university where he is serving now, and the Director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies and Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Director of the Center for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in the University of Durham. He received a DPhil in International Relations from Sussex University and a bachelor's degree in Politics, Philosophy and Economics from Oxford University. His research interests are wide, but they deal mainly with the political economy of Arab and Islamic states, the international relations of Middle Eastern studies, Islam and the state, civil society and political power in the Arab world, and so on and so forth. He really has a truly distinguished bio, and we are very fortunate to have someone of his expertise and his eminence. We look forward to your presentation, Professor Niblock, on the future of political transformation in West Asia.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's very nice to be here. I should say in starting that I've been very impressed by the comments and papers which have been given so far. And indeed, I think there's a continuum about our panel from the comments of the Chairman at the beginning through Ambassador Talmiz and to Dr. Suleimanpour and on to my own. There is a broadly optimistic trend, I think, in the views put forward. And I fit within that framework. And I am going to focus on one particular aspect which I think is important, and that is how these events within the Arab world are seen by those of us outside. Because there is a reality which is rather humbling, which is that us, so-called specialists in the region, whether we are academics or diplomats or journalists or whatever, whether we come from the region or outside of it, we have not been all that good in predicting what might happen. All of us, of course, knew the failings of regimes before the Arab Spring, the kinds of failings which Ambassador Talmiz has referred to. We all knew that sooner or later things would have to change. And yet, when the Arab Spring broke out, we were taken by surprise by how quickly regimes fell, and how quickly it spread from one Arab country to another. And now, subsequent to those events, I think we are being taken by surprise again. What were initially being seen in the West, in particular, as democratic revolutions, are now seen by many observers, although not by me, and I think not by the people on the panel, as failed revolutions. The phrase onset of an Arab winter is being used in many quarters. And one finds that at many levels of government within the West, and also among some academics. And I think the cause of us being taken by surprise must lie in faulty assumptions, misunderstandings which we have about the nature of Arab politics and the nature of the unfolding events as they occur. And I think it's very important, therefore, to unpick some of those assumptions, some of those misunderstandings, if we are to understand how the political transformation of the Arab world is going and where it is leading, And that is what my paper seeks to do. I should say that I'm referring here to the Arab world. I know that this conference talks about West Asia, but I think one does need to take West Asia and North Africa. What one has seen in the Arab Spring is this cultural conveyor belt, if you like, of ideas going from one Arab country to another. And in that, the Arab countries of North Africa, of course, have played a very important role, linking in with Arab countries in West Asia. In my paper, I put forward 5 reasons, 5 misunderstandings at the early stage in not thinking that something like the Arab Spring would occur. I don't want to go through all of those because I want to concentrate really on what has happened since the Arab Spring. But I will just bring out 2 of those. One faulty assumption was that these were regimes which could not be removed by popular protest. We were under the impression that popular protest was something of the past, that the regimes were locked in, if you like, by the incredible power which they had and the incredible fear which the populations had. And with this combination of power on one side and fear on the other, popular protests could not really take off. And I think it's important to recognize how wrong we were on that, how quickly power and fear changed sides. The regimes becoming fearful of what their populations would do, and the populations feeling empowered once they had started demonstrating, once they had started their uprisings, feeling that they could take their fate into their own hands and try to shape their futures. And I think that aspect of a sense of popular empowerment has been transformative, and I think it will continue to be transformative. And the second faulty assumption which I want to mention was that the levels of inequality and injustice within the Arab world, while substantial and recognized, were nonetheless tolerable. That somehow these inequalities and injustices were all part of a process of globalization which could deliver development and deliver benefits to all of the population in the long term. And yet we were quite wrong about that. In practice, the combination of the extreme inequality, the flaunted wealth of the elite, the high levels of unemployment, especially among the educated youth, and the spreading consciousness that the central figures in the regimes and their families were massively corrupt, looting the wealth of the country, meant that the situation was simply not tolerable. It could be set alight by a single spark, as indeed it was. So in my paper I go through other mistaken assumptions, but now I want to look at what has happened since the outbreak of the Arab Spring, because I think one has gone into some other faulty assumptions. Just after the uprisings broke out and through 2011, I think observers outside, especially in the West, quickly reached a new kind of consensus about what was happening within the region. And there were 3 aspects of this, and all of them were linked together. The first one was that these were democratic revolutions, similar to those which had occurred in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia, the flower revolutions, the colored revolutions, and whatever, the velvet revolution in Czechoslovakia as it was then, the rose revolution, the orange revolution, the tulip revolution, and so on. that what was happening in the Arab world was simply an application of the same thing, fitted in within that kind of framework, and would lead to the same kind of results. And the second part of the consensus was that the remaining authoritarian regimes in the region were doomed sooner or later. Probably in the short term they would fall, otherwise in the slightly longer term. And the third part of the consensus was that the liberal democratic regimes which would be created and were being created, so it was seen, by the uprisings, would provide a sound basis for resolving the social and economic problems which face the countries. Under democratic regimes, it was thought, there would be less corruption and mismanagement. The regimes would be able to concentrate on the acute social and economic problems which the countries faced and would be able to resolve them. So that was in 2011. But in 2012, I think one has seen a very different kind of consensus emerging, at least among some Western observers and some governments, people in the West, in fact a lot of government people in the West, and also among some academics. And as I said before, this is characterized by the idea of the failure of the Arab Spring, the start of the Arab winter and whatever. And the reasons put forward for that are, firstly, that some of the uprisings have failed to achieve their objective of overthrowing the regimes, or have led on to massive civil conflicts, as in Syria, maybe to a lesser extent in Bahrain. Secondly, that some of the regimes have proved remarkably adept at remaining in power and of resisting change, and indeed in some cases seem to have used the opportunity to tighten control over their populations. And here, of course, reference is often made to the Arabian Peninsula, especially the monarchies. And thirdly, where uprisings have been successful and have led to elections, the general trend has been for movements to gain power whose commitment to democracy was seen or has been seen as being questionable and perhaps more socially restrictive than the previous regimes. And the reference there, of course, is to Islamist movements and their role in new regimes. And the last reason why there's been this negative attitude has been that new governments which have come to power through elections, and in particular in Tunisia and Egypt, have been seen as failing to address effectively the social and economic problems facing their societies. It is considered that they'd spend too much time on petty constitutional issues which are considered to be petty at any rate, and are not focusing on economic reform and the management of society in a way which solves the outstanding problems. Now, I'm not convinced by much of this new consensus, as I've called it. And I'd like to explain why. I'd like to put forward 5 points which I believe are critical to making an accurate and realistic assessment of where things are going and may go in the future. Firstly, it is, I think, dangerous to put events quickly into preconceived categories. Democratic revolutions, for example, or more recently Islamist revolutions, as some people have said. I think that can lead very quickly to distorted expectations and distorted understandings. I'm not saying that there weren't strong elements wanting democracy, but I am saying that many different kinds of issues came up and were promoted by those who demonstrated in the streets. They were motivated by many different emotions and beliefs: despair at prolonged unemployment, perhaps, or the rising cost of living; anger at the wealth of the elite; feelings that power was being monopolized by one particular ethnic or religious group or one particular part of the population; resentment at the general authoritarianism of the regime, and so on. Some people were motivated by the oppressive conditions imposed on women in society, and others alienated by the secularism or un-Islamic practices of society and of the political system. Now, no doubt all of these people on the streets wanted more political space in which to express their own views and their own objectives. And it was natural that they raised slogans of freedom, as of course one does in that kind of situation, and perhaps democracy. But that does not mean that they had common views as to the kind of political structures which should be instituted or the kind of society they wanted to live in. They didn't. And I think the outcome of these uprisings needs to be seen over time. We won't know until quite a lot of years later how you can usefully characterize these systems which are emerging. It is, I think, better to abandon preconceptions and look at what has actually changed. The regimes which are emerging within the Arab world may not follow a Western liberal democratic form, but the character of political power, I think, has changed. There is comment at the moment on some of the new leaderships, say, in Egypt or Tunisia, acting as if they are a new pharaoh, as has been said, or that they are fitting back into the same kind of pattern as previous presidents, and that the structure of power is coming to be rather similar. But I think that is not true. I think something very substantial has changed. Political power no longer takes the form of a single integrated political force. And the key element here, I think, goes back to the issue of empowerment. There is now a sense of empowerment coming out of the uprisings, and I think that shows no signs of abating. At the moment, you can look at television and at events taking place in Tunisia and Egypt, and you can, of course, see these in a negative light if you want to. There seems to be violence, intense demonstrations. But on the other hand, you can look at these and say, well, at last now people are mobilizing. They feel the possibility of bringing about change through their actions on the streets and elsewhere, in social media as well, in newspapers and whatever. This sense of empowerment. And I think it's impressive to see at the moment the way in which parts of society are mobilizing and trying to gain popular support in ways in which they haven't done before. Ambassador Talmiz rightly referred to the fact that for so many years in the Arab world, in fact for most of the 20th century, it was the secular elite, if you like, who was taking a leadership role in most of the countries of the Arab world, at least perhaps apart from some of the monarchies. And I think that is quite true. And one of the tragedies which followed from that, I think, was that as a whole, the secular liberal part of society did very little in terms of mobilization. It didn't actually try to gain popular support. The popular mobilization, I think, was all done on one side, at least mostly done on one side, which tended to be Muslim Brothers and Islamists. and to their credit, they were very effective in doing that. So one has seen new forms of mobilization take place through this feeling of empowerment. And it seems to me likely that the pattern of governments in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, but also in Iraq, Libya and Morocco over the next decade, is most likely to be that of negotiated power with popular involvement. In other words, regimes in which there is not a single integrated force at the center, but where power has to be negotiated between different groups. And as I say, with popular involvement. The nature of elections might be disputed and whatever, but the element of popular involvement through popular empowerment, I think, is bound to be there. Indeed, to some extent, it provides the legitimacy which has brought new regimes to power, and I think it will remain there. The second assumption is one which I won't cover in detail because actually the chairman at the beginning has mentioned it. The political systems of the Arab world, I think, will become more diverse in character and dynamics than they were prior to the uprisings. They were, whatever the institutional form, they were actually rather similar prior to the uprisings. Once you open them out, once you have the element of popular empowerment, then greater expression can be given to the particular characteristics of individual countries. The nature of the social balance can reflect itself more clearly in the structures which develop. The third point I'd make is that ideological positions should not be regarded as being fixed and unchangeable. And I think Ambassador Talmiz has already given us reason to believe that, to see that with regard to the Islamist side. The reality is that when political groups which have been outside of the political process before come into the possibility of gaining power, they adapt themselves. The political slogans which they had before are no longer quite so relevant because they're seeking now to gain popular support. And they have to manage, if they do get into power, with the realities of the economy, of administration, and so on. And one saw very well, I think, in Europe, in Western Europe, the way in which communist parties in Western Europe adapted and changed the closer they came to political power. I'm thinking in particular of the case of Italy, where Italy was, of course, the place where so-called Euro-communism really developed, a revision to a lot of the ideas and practices of communist parties in the past, and the key changes took place when they were on the verge of political power, and indeed when they cooperated in a government in Italy this is back in the 1970s. And I think one can foresee a similar kind of process taking place within Islamist movements. My fourth point is that the extent of social and economic inequality in West Asia and North Africa has been and remains an unstable basis on which to build participative and representative political systems. I think we saw in the previous regimes pressures being put on by Western countries apparently for them to reform, and so they liberalized in little bits around the edges, but they didn't liberalize the central thrust of the regimes, and in a way they had too much to lose. The linkage between political power and economic well-being was too close, was too tight. And I think one will find the same problem again now with the new regimes if those kind of inequalities remain. There does need to be less inequality in order to have functional systems which have a significant element of representation. There's a fifth assumption which I make, which you can read in my paper, but as I've almost finished my 20 minutes, I will conclude on overall. In practice, it seems to me that the central issue for Arab countries, as for most countries with less well-established political institutions, remains the same as it was before. In other words, the central issue is how to create and maintain political systems where those who govern are accountable to the population, where social and economic problems can be effectively addressed, and where the population feels a sense of common purpose and common identity. Now, I think it's rather important to recognize that those issues are the same issues as the regimes which have now been replaced had at the beginning of their time. In other words, if you go back to to when they came to power, I'm thinking of the 1950s and the 1960s, the Arab nationalist, Arab socialist revolutions, whether under Nasserism or Baathism or whatever, they were all ways of responding to this issue, and they had their own kind of solutions to those. They believed that you could solve those problems through rapid development, through a focus on fostering the development of the rural areas, electrification of the villages, spreading of education and health, accountability through fostering popular participation in supposedly all-encompassing single parties, and so on. And there were times when these objectives seemed capable of bringing success, but ultimately the regimes failed to deliver what had been promised. And now the new regimes represent a new approach to resolving the same problems. Their success will, I think, be measurable over the long term and not the short term. It is at present too soon to draw negative conclusions about the outcome of the uprisings. A sense of hope remains, I think, the correct approach. Thank you.